Hey, everybody. Welcome to lesson 4 in our Just Mercy series, Justice in the People of God. And let me start with the question. If you were going to try to sum up the message of the Bible, the whole message of the Bible, in a sentence or two, what would it be? I think probably a good description is the one that, or a good summation is what's used in the Bible itself. And that is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. One of the main themes of the Bible is that believers should love their neighbors. It's part of the Mosaic Law in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. That same language is cited repeatedly over and over in the New Testament, in the Gospels, in Romans, in Galatians, in James. And we ended last week's class on justice in the New Testament by making the point that helping the weak and vulnerable did not just include the family of faith, but all people. In the Old Testament, the outsider, the alien, could convert to Judaism, but that was not required for them to receive financial help. And Paul doesn't let us off the hook in Galatians chapter 6, verse 10. He says, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, but especially to those who belong to the family of believers. Now, in this lesson, what I want to do is I want us to kind of zoom in on justice in the New Testament on this perspective, to think about how we should treat the vulnerable using what is probably the most famous story that Jesus ever told. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. And what we're going to do is we're going to learn about justice and my neighbor, justice and our neighbors. Let's just start. I know you know the story, but let's just start. Let's read through it real quickly and let me make a few comments as we go. In Luke 10:25, it says, on one occasion, an expert in the law, and this is probably a Pharisee or one of the lawyers, lawyers, one of the experts in the law, stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now, right off the bat, you know that this is a setup. The law expert wants to trap Jesus, maybe because of Jesus spent a lot of time with irreligious people, with sinners, with the outcasts of society. And maybe the law experts thought that Jesus was a little weak on obedience. Maybe they thought he was a little weak on requiring people to obey the laws of God. So he thinks Jesus is downplaying obedience to God's laws. Jesus responds, though, with a question of his own, which is always a great tactic, by the way. So when I ask you a question, respond with a question. What's written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? Well, I guess this law expert could have quoted the whole law, but instead he decided to give a summary of the law in Luke 10:27 through 28. He said, you'd love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. Now, this is a brilliant riposte on the part of Jesus. In effect, Jesus' message is something like this. Have you really seen what kind of life God really wants from you? Do you love God with every fiber of your being, every moment of the day? Do you meet the needs of your neighbor with all the joy and the energy and the care with which you meet your own needs? And Jesus said, if you can do that perfectly, if you can live a life like that, then you will certainly merit eternal life. Jesus' reply, what he does here is he creates an impossibly high standard. That was the point. He was trying to convict this man of his sin, of the impossibility of self-salvation. Jesus, in effect, is saying, my friend, I want you to know I do take the laws of God seriously, even more seriously than you do. If you can do what it commands, you will live. Of course, the point is, you can't. And so this should have been a humbling moment for this teacher, which would have driven him towards the grace of God. But Luke 10:29 says he wanted to justify himself and he asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? He's saying, yeah, I see that we must love our neighbors, but what does it really mean to love your neighbor, and who does that really mean? And this law expert wants to whittle down the command to make it more achievable, and to keep his works righteousness approach to life intact. He wants to be able to justify himself, and he's saying, surely you don't mean that we have to love and meet the needs of everyone, do we? Well, in response, Jesus told this story that we call the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10:30 through 35. Jesus replies, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, said, look after him, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Now let's think about who are the main players in the main players in the story here. There are 4 of them. The Jewish man who was robbed. There was the priest. There was the Levite, and then there was the Samaritan. The priest and the Levite see this man who's hurt, and they pass by on the other side. And the question, of course, is why. Some say, well, it's because if you touch a dead person, or you're unclean. I think that's the case, but because Jesus goes out of his way to say he's half dead, he's not whole dead. They passed by on the other side. They didn't even want to see. Perhaps they didn't think they had the time. The implication of a priest and a Levite is maybe they're heading from Jericho up to the temple in Jerusalem, and they've got religious duties to do. Or maybe it would just have been, maybe it was a trap. Maybe this guy was faking, and we were, uncertain about whether or not they should stop because he might just be laying a trap to rob them. Or it may have been that this was just an extremely dangerous road, and it's not good policy to stop on a desolate road in a region filled with robbers or with bandits. In any event, they moved on. Then a Samaritan came down the road, and you've got to ask yourself, okay, why does Jesus use a Samaritan? What did the Jews think of Samaritans? Well, let me tell you, as simply as I can, the Jews hated Samaritans. When Israel was taken into captivity, not all of the Israelites were taken into captivity. There were some who remained, and they ended up marrying Canaanites and indigenous people in the region. And so the Samaritans, which was in a region which would have been west of the Galilee River, between the Dead Sea and just above Jerusalem, between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, they considered them as racial half-breeds, religious heretics, because they ended up in the Old Testament. They built the northern kingdoms built their own temples in the north, and didn't come to Jerusalem to worship. And so there was huge animosity between the Jews and Samaritans. In fact, if a Jew was traveling from Judea and wanted to go to Galilee, he would cross the Jordan River just near the Dead Sea and go to the east side of the Jordan River, travel up through what was then called Decapolis, and then cross back over. They didn't even want to walk in Samaria. They'd want their feet to touch Samaria. So they absolutely hated them. They hated them. They despised them. They were disgusting people. And what's interesting is that we read this, and it doesn't mean a whole lot to us because we don't understand that real background. But to make an application here, you really need to try to come up with someone, some people someone that would really, really make you angry. Maybe coming down the road were two prominent American Christians, Max Lucado and Billy Graham, and they both passed by on the other side. And then came Osama bin Laden, and he stopped, and he helped this man. I don't know if that would do it or not. Or two super religious people and an atheist, a modern day hater of Christianity. I don't know. It's interesting, back at Abilene Christian University in the 60s, I think it was, Bruce can verify this, there was someone who taught this parable and used two white people who passed by on the other side, and then a black person stopped and helped. And it was a scandal when that speaker did that. In any event, the Samaritan saw the man on the road. He was moved to compassion and pity. He stopped. He rendered emergency medical aid, and then he transported him to an inn. And then he paid the innkeeper and charged him to care for the man. And the implication is until he was fully recovered. And then and this would have been a substantial expense. But the Samaritan says, you tend to him, you care for him until he's completely well. And when I come back, I'll pay you for any expense you have. Amazing. Now, we have to ask, what's Jesus' purpose here? What's he doing with this story? Well, he's giving us an answer to a radical answer to the question, what does it mean to love your neighbor? This is about a definition of what love is. And Jesus answered that by depicting a man meeting material, physical, and economic needs with deeds. So caring for people's material and economic needs is not an option for Jesus. He refused to allow this law expert to limit the implications of this command to love our neighbor. He said it meant being sacrificially involved with the vulnerable, just as the Samaritan risked his life by stopping on the road. Jesus refuses to let us limit not only how we love, but who we love. It's typical, very typical for us to think of our neighbors as people of the same social class and means that we are. I mean, that's typical. But he depicts here, by depicting a Samaritan helping a Jew, Jesus could not have found a more forceful way, and by the way, offensive way, to say that anyone at all in need, regardless of race, politics, class, and religion, regardless, that person is your neighbor. In other words, not everyone is your brother or sister in the faith, but everyone is your neighbor if they're in need, and you are to love your neighbor, to do something. Timothy Keller in Generous Justice, which is a primary source for this class, discusses some objections that he's heard through the years when he's preached this sermon on the Good Samaritan. And he does it in an interesting way. What he does is he uses a sermon that was preached in 1733 by Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was the minister for the Congregational Church in Northampton, Massachusetts. And he preached a sermon entitled "The Duty of Charity to the Poor." Edwards had become aware that in Northampton, Massachusetts, there was growing poverty and an increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots in his town. Now, some of the reasons for this were socioeconomic. By 1730, and you can look up the history, by 1730, most of the town's usable land had been parceled out, and so anyone who was a newcomer or maybe young families, they found it very, very difficult to create an economic foothold. Conflicts began to grow between creditors and debtors, long-term residents and newcomers, young and old. And so this was socioeconomic, but Edwards also believed that part of the reason for the rising tension in the city was spiritual. This tension between the haves and the have-nots, that this was spiritual. And in the sermon, he preached about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the heart of the sermon is Jonathan Edwards answering a series of common objections in his day that he heard when he preached this parable or spoke about the duty of sharing money and goods with the poor. Now, all the questions they are remarkably up to date. Um, uh, and all the questions seek to put limits on this injunction to love one another. Let me share them with you, a few of them. Some would say the poor are needy, but they're not destitute. And in 1733 speak, though they be needy, yet they are not in extremity. I don't know. Today we might say, well, all those poor people on the other side of town are, they have cell phones, they got nice TV sets, they're not starving. I mean, some of them are grossly overweight. They're needy, but they're not destitute. Well, Jonathan Edwards would say we do not wait until we are in extremity before doing something about our condition. So why would we wait until our neighbor is literally starving before we help? And Edwards goes further. He asks if Christians who say this remember that we're to love others as Christ loved them. This is what he wrote. The Christian spirit will make us apt to sympathize with our neighbor. When we see him under any difficulty, we ought to have a spirit of love to him, that we should be afflicted with him in his affliction. Christ literally walked in our shoes and entered into our affliction. And so, those who will not help others until they are destitute in extremity reveal that Christ's love has not yet turned them into the sympathetic, compassionate persons the gospel should make them. So the poor are needy but not desperate, that doesn't work. Another objection: we don't have anything to spare. I mean, we barely have enough to meet our own needs. One of the lessons of the Good Samaritan parable is that real love entails risk and sacrifice. Edwards responded that what he said was, when you say I can't help anyone, what you usually mean is I can't help anyone without burdening myself and cutting in on how I live from day to day. And again, Edwards argues that is exactly what biblical love requires, that we sacrifice. He says we, in many cases, by the rule of the gospel, be obliged to give to others when we can't without suffering ourselves. If our neighbor's difficulties and necessities are much greater than ours, and we see that they are not likely to be relieved, we should be willing to suffer with them and take part of the burden upon ourselves. Or else, how is that rule fulfilled of bearing one another's burdens? If we are never obliged to relieve others' burdens, but only when we can do it without burdening ourselves, then how do we bear our neighbor's burdens when we bear no burden at all? Man, that's really to the point. We rejoice with those who rejoice, and we mourn with those who mourn, and we get in the trenches and help people, even when we don't feel like we have enough to spare. Here's another very common. This is 1700s now. The poor person is often of very ill temper. He is of an ungrateful spirit. He does not have upright moral characters. Now, the same thing as I've helped lots of poor people. They often do not jump for joy when they're helped. And I think it probably there's something here to be said for thinking a little bit more deeply about the poor and about what drives their own motivations and why they might not be as excited as we think they should be when we try to help them. But we all want to be able to help upright people who will respond with gratitude and with joy. The problem is, I'm not sure there are a whole lot of those kind of people that exist. Remember that the causes of poverty, they're complex, they're intertwined. And while it's important that our aid to the poor really help them and not create a dependency, Edwards deals with these objections by, again, appealing to the gospel. He says, Christ loved us and was kind to us and was willing to relieve us, though we were very hateful persons, of an evil disposition, not deserving of any good, so that we should be willing to be kind to those who are very undeserving. We've got to love like Christ loved us. And then here's another objection. Well, that poor person has brought himself to poverty by his own fault. In other words, the poor have often contributed to their own condition, and that is no doubt. Um, but first, Edwards points out that it's possible that some people simply don't have a natural faculty to manage affairs to advantage. Now, we talked about this I think a couple of weeks ago, where the Bible talks about natural disasters being one of the things that um, causes poverty. And sometimes people are walking natural disasters. I mean, they just don't have the capacity. They just make very bad decisions about money and possessions. And you try to teach and you try to teach, but they just don't have that. Edwards suggests that we should consider this lack of faculty to be something similar to like a lack of eyesight. Listen to what he says. Such a faculty is of making good decisions with money is a gift that God bestows on some and not on others. And it is not only owing to themselves. This is as reasonable as that he to whom providence has imparted sight should be willing to help him to whom sight is denied, and that he who should have the benefit of the sight of others who has none of his own. We should still help them. Well, but what if their economic situation is, directly a result of their own selfish, lazy, or violent behavior? Or to put it in the language of Edwards' day, if they are come to want by a vicious idleness and prodigality, we are not thereby excused from all obligation to relieve them unless they continue in their vices. Because, he explains, Christ found us in the same condition. Our spiritual bankruptcy was due to our own sin, yet he came and he gave us what we needed. Here's what Jonathan Edwards said. The rules of the gospel direct us to forgive them, for Christ hath loved us, pitied us, and greatly laid out himself to relieve us from that want and misery which we brought on ourselves by our own folly and wickedness. We foolishly and perversely threw away those riches with which we were provided, upon which we might have lived and been happy to all eternity. So we forgive them and we keep helping. Well, what if they continue in their vices? What if they continue in this selfish, lazy, violent behavior? He goes on to suggest that we should help them if for no other reason than for the family. So, sometimes he says we'll need to give aid to families even when the parents act irresponsibly. We're doing it for the children's sake. If they continue in the same courses still yet, if we can't relieve those of their families without them having something of it, yet they ought not to be that ought not to be a bar in the way of our charity. Well, there's just not a lot of room here left for equivocation. Doesn't seem like to me anyway. Let's play a little what if. One of the remarkable twists in the parable of the Good Samaritan is that it was the placement of the Jewish man as the victim in the story. Remember that Jesus is telling this story to a Jewish man who's a law expert. What if Jesus had told the parable like this? A Samaritan was beaten up and left half dead in a road. Then a Jewish man came along the road. He saw him and had compassion on him and ministered to him. I wonder how the Jewish expert would have responded. They hated the Samaritans so much, it might have been he would have responded, no self-respecting Jew would ever do such a thing. So by making the Jewish man the victim, he is actually asking all listeners through the centuries to imagine themselves to be the victim of violence, dying with no hope if this Samaritan doesn't stop and do something to help. How would you want the Samaritan to act if you were the victim? Wouldn't you want him to be a neighbor to you across all racial, religious barriers? Of course you would. If you were across the border and you were trying to get into America because you desperately wanted to help your family? What would you want people to do? Well, I'm not necessarily saying we just willy-nilly throw open the doors, but there ought to be some way to help people. What Jesus is saying is something like this. What if your only hope was to get help from someone who not only did not owe you any help, but who actually owed you the opposite? What if your only hope was to get free grace from someone who had every justification based on your relationship to that person to trample you? And so Jesus ends the parable with a question, verse 36. Which of these three do you think, he asked the law expert, was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the law expert didn't have a leg to stand on. He said, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, well, you go do likewise. Folks, the overarching point here is that your neighbor is anyone in need. Whether they're American or not, whether they're in your same economic bracket or not, whether they're the same race or not, whether they're in the same political party or not, it doesn't make any difference. Anyone who is in need is your neighbor. It could be a refugee, it could be a citizen, it could be an alien, it could be a legal resident or an illegal resident. The only way you'll ever consistently give this kind of neighbor love is if you can see how graciously you have been saved and treated by a God who owes you nothing. Only then are you going to go out into the world looking for absolutely anyone who is in need. Now, we've talked about the what for 4 weeks. Next week, we're going to focus on the why. Why should we do justice? And I hope you'll join us. Until then, God bless.